The safe zone was once a beacon of hope. Inside its reinforced walls, humanity had built a fragile sense of normalcy. People went about their daily routines, living in relative peace after the chaos of the world outside. But even the strongest walls cannot hold forever, and the cracks began to show. The residents had grown complacent, unaware of the looming disaster just beyond their gates. Ethan, a young security officer stationed at the northern wall, stood at his post, scanning the horizon. The world outside was nothing but a barren wasteland. The dead roamed freely, their flesh decayed, their movements erratic, but the safe zone had been secure for months now. Or so it seemed. Ethan had heard rumors, whispers in the dark corners of the camp, that something was wrong. The walls were starting to show signs of wear, and strange noises echoed in the night. But it was always dismissed as paranoia. Inside the safe zone, life went on. Families gathered in the communal areas, children played under the watchful eyes of their parents, and people worked tirelessly to maintain the illusion of safety. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. People began to question their leaders, wondering if they were truly safe or if they were merely living in a gilded cage. Ethan had seen it all. The desperation in people's eyes, the fear of what lay outside the walls, and the uncertainty that gripped their every move. Yet, he kept his doubts to himself. His job was to protect the gates, not to question the system. But today felt different. The weather was eerily calm, and the air held a heavy stillness. Ethan noticed a group of survivors returning from a scavenging mission. Their clothes were torn, and they carried a strange look in their eyes, something between exhaustion and fear. As they approached the gate, they were greeted by the usual barrage of questions from the guards. But there was something off about them. They avoided eye contact, fidgeting nervously. "Did you find anything useful?" Ethan asked, trying to gauge their reactions. One of the men, a grizzled survivor named Mark, glanced at him but didn't respond. Instead, he motioned toward the inner camp. "Just open the gate, man," Mark muttered, his voice hoarse. "There's no time." Ethan hesitated, sensing that something was terribly wrong. The gate was only supposed to be open for approved individuals, but Mark's urgency made him second-guess the rules. With a reluctant nod, Ethan signaled to the other guards, and the massive gates creaked open. As the group passed through the threshold, a low growl echoed in the distance, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps, far too many to be human. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He turned toward the noise, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sound grew louder, and then it came into view, a massive horde of zombies, moving in a coordinated fashion toward the safe zone. A sense of dread washed over Ethan. His pulse quickened, and his fingers clenched around his radio, but before he could speak, Mark's voice interrupted him. "They're here," Mark said, his face pale. "They're inside." Confusion swept over Ethan. "What do you mean, inside?" But before Mark could answer, a scream pierced the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Panic erupted in the camp as the alarm bells rang, signaling the beginning of the end. The horde, now less than a mile away, was closing in fast. Ethan sprinted toward the inner camp, his thoughts racing. What had happened? How had they gotten inside? And why hadn't the wall been secured? Inside, chaos was already unfolding. People scrambled for weapons, mothers grabbed their children, and soldiers took their positions. The once peaceful safe zone was now a battleground. Ethan's eyes scanned the area for his superior officer, but there was no sign of him. The safe zone's leaders were nowhere to be found. "Ethan, get to the north wall," shouted a fellow security officer. "We need to reinforce it before they breach." Ethan nodded, but as he turned toward the gates, something caught his eye. A dark shape moved at the edge of the camp, too quick to be human. Then another. And another. They were already inside, and they were hunting. This sets up the tension and impending doom, keeping the audience engaged and intrigued about what happens next. Would you like me to continue with the next part? Ethan's mind raced as he sprinted through the chaos unfolding within the safe zone. The alarm bells blared relentlessly, their shrill sound amplifying the panic that had already set in. People were running in every direction, desperate to escape the impending danger. The smell of fear mixed with the stench of sweat and the acrid scent of gunpowder as soldiers hurriedly manned their posts. But despite their efforts, there was an eerie sense of inevitability in the air. Reaching the northern wall, Ethan was met by a scene he could never have imagined. The massive, reinforced gates, the last line of defense, were shaking under the force of the Horde's relentless assault. The once impenetrable barrier that had kept the horrors of the world outside was now a mere illusion. Ethan felt his stomach tighten as he watched the zombies slam against the gates, their rotting hands reaching through the narrow slats, clawing at anything within their reach. "Reinforce the barricade," shouted a voice from above. It was Officer Davis, the head of security, who had managed to rally a few of the guards to mount a last-ditch defense. Ethan's heart sank as he saw Davis, his face grim, directing the efforts to hold the line. "Where's the backup?" Ethan asked, his voice barely audible over the clamor of the crowd. He could see soldiers frantically moving around, setting up makeshift defenses, but the walls were already showing signs of wear. The zombies weren't just attacking, they were organizing. Davis's eyes were wild, his gaze darting from one side of the barricade to the other. "We're on our own now. Backup's not coming. They're already overwhelmed outside. This is it." Ethan swallowed hard, trying to push the panic down. He had seen the horror of the undead firsthand before, but never like this. The zombies were not mindless creatures, there was something different about them. They moved with purpose, almost as if they knew exactly where to strike. It was as though they had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the safe zone to fall. "We need to get inside," Davis ordered, his voice steely with urgency. "If the gates go, we need to take refuge in the inner sector. Move! Now!" Ethan hesitated for only a second, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. But there was no time. With a nod, he turned and ran toward the inner camp, where the survivors were being corralled into safe zones by the remaining guards. But the chaos didn't end there. As Ethan neared the inner camp, he heard screams coming from the medical quarters. His heart skipped a beat. The medical staff had always been the first to respond to any crisis, but now the situation was far beyond their control. The Safe Zones clinic was a haven for the sick and injured, but now it had become a death trap. A large crowd had gathered outside, trying to break through the gates leading to the medical sector. Ethan pushed his way through, his pulse hammering in his ears. When he reached the gates, he found them wide open, blood splattered across the pavement, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps dragging. A scream cut through the air, followed by the sickening sound of flesh being torn. A survivor, barely clinging to life, was being dragged away by the undead, their teeth sinking into his throat as he was pulled into the darkness. "Get back!" Ethan shouted, grabbing the nearest soldier by the arm and pulling him away from the gates. "Don't just stand there, get the people inside." But it was too late. The doors had already been breached. Panic spread like wildfire. People pushed and shoved to escape the open gates, but the zombies were faster, more relentless than anyone could have anticipated. The swarm was inside, and the safe zone was no longer a refuge. It was a killing ground. Ethan's mind raced as he pushed through the crowd, trying to make his way to the emergency exits. His hand gripped his weapon tighter, the weight of his responsibility heavier than ever before. He had sworn to protect these people, to keep them safe, but now it seemed like all he could do was run. He glanced over his shoulder just in time to see the northern wall crumble under the weight of the horde. The barricades gave way with a loud crash, and the zombies surged forward, their eyes fixed on the helpless humans trapped within the walls. Their moans grew louder, echoing throughout the safe zone, a terrifying reminder of the world they had once tried to escape. Inside the chaos, Ethan's thoughts were a blur. There was no more time for strategy, no more time for plans. It was survival now. "Move it!" Davis shouted, appearing beside him with a handful of soldiers. "We're falling back to the command center. Get to the barricade, now!" Ethan nodded grimly, falling into step with the group. The command center was the last remaining stronghold, the only place that had a chance of holding out against the overwhelming tide of the undead. But as they moved, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The safe zone was falling. And with it, humanity's last hope. The command center was once a symbol of safety, a place where the leaders of the safe zone gathered to monitor the situation outside, plan supply runs, and ensure the security of their people. Now, it had become a final refuge, a last bastion against the unstoppable force that was tearing the safe zone apart. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted toward the command center, his footsteps echoing in the narrow hallways. The once orderly facility was now filled with panic. Officers and civilians alike were scrambling, trying to secure the doors, gather weapons, and make last-minute plans. But the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. The safe zone was lost, and they knew it. Ethan's mind raced as he entered the central control room. Davis was already there, barking orders to the remaining soldiers, his face grim but determined. The walls of the command center were lined with monitors, each showing live feeds from the outer perimeter of the safe zone. The screens flickered, the image distorted by static and interference, but there was no mistaking the truth. The zombies were inside, and they were closing in fast. "They're all over the walls," Davis said, his voice low, almost detached. "The barricades won't hold for much longer." Ethan scanned the room, his gaze falling on the map of the safe zone that was pinned to the wall. The perimeter was already breached in several places. The zombies were swarming the northern, eastern, and western gates, and the southern entrance was now a pile of rubble. There was no escape. "How long do we have?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with urgency. Davis met his gaze inside. "An hour, maybe 2, if we're lucky. After that, it's over." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. The reality of the situation was sinking in. They were on their own now, with no reinforcements coming. The safe zone had been their last hope, and now it was falling apart around them. "We need to fortify the command center," Davis continued, his voice taking on a sense of urgency. "Block all the exits, secure the doors, and make sure no one gets in or out. We'll hold here as long as we can." Ethan nodded, turning to the nearest soldier. "Get to the back door. Barricade it with whatever you can find." The soldier nodded and ran off, and Ethan turned back to Davis. "What's the plan after that? We can't just sit here and wait to die." Davis hesitated for a moment, his eyes dark with the weight of the decision. "We'll make a stand. When the time comes, we fight. We take as many down as we can, and if we're lucky, someone will make it out." Ethan's blood ran cold at the thought. There was no way out. They were trapped, and the zombies were closing in. But there was no choice now. They had to fight. Outside, the sounds of destruction grew louder. Screams echoed through the walls, and the unmistakable moans of the undead reverberated in the distance. The safe zone was no longer a sanctuary, it was a tomb, and every passing second brought them closer to their inevitable fate. Ethan paced the command center, trying to think of a way out. His mind raced as he remembered the secret tunnels that led beneath the safe zone. They were originally built as emergency escape routes, but they hadn't been used in years. They were likely blocked by debris, or worse, infested with the undead. But it was the only chance they had. "We need to check the tunnels," Ethan said suddenly, his voice urgent. Davis frowned. "The tunnels? We don't have time for that. We need to focus on holding the line." "There's no line left to hold," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "The walls are breached, the horde is inside, and we're surrounded. If we don't make a move now, we'll be trapped here." Davis hesitated, his face tense with indecision. "You're right," he muttered. "All right, we check the tunnels. But we don't waste time." The soldiers quickly made their way to the back of the command center, where a hidden door led to the network of tunnels. The narrow, dimly lit passageways had been untouched for years, but they still held the faint scent of stale air and dust. The further they went, the more the silence grew oppressive, broken only by the sounds of distant screams and gunfire. Ethan led the way, his mind racing. Could they make it out in time? Would the tunnels still be passable, or would they be blocked? The answers came too quickly. At the end of the tunnel, the door that led to the outside world was rusted shut, its hinges long since broken. Ethan tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. He pushed harder, his muscles straining, and with one final shove, the door gave way. Beyond it lay the bleak reality of the world outside, desolate, overrun, and full of danger. As they stepped into the open air, Ethan looked back at the safe zone one last time. It had been their refuge, their home, but now it was a graveyard. The zombies had claimed it. "We move quickly," Davis said, snapping Ethan back to reality. "We don't know how much time we have." Ethan nodded, and together, they stepped into the unknown. The air outside was thick with the scent of decay. The safe zone, once a symbol of hope, now lay in ruins behind them, a silent testament to the collapse of humanity's last refuge. The survivors stepped into a world that had turned into a nightmare, their eyes adjusting to the harsh light of the post-apocalyptic landscape. Ethan's breath caught as he looked around. Nothing was familiar anymore. The world he had known was gone. As they moved through the narrow tunnel entrance, the cold wind bit at their skin. The tunnels beneath the safe zone were supposed to be a means of escape, a secret route to safety in case of a worst-case scenario. But now, as Ethan looked out over the desolate terrain, he realized there was no safe left. The world had been ravaged, and what lay ahead was far from certain. Davis motioned for everyone to keep moving. "Stay close. We don't know what's out there." Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He looked over his shoulder, half expecting to see a horde of zombies trailing them. The group had left the confines of the safe zone, but the outside world was just as dangerous, perhaps more so. The city streets were littered with abandoned vehicles, and the distant sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from what seemed like every direction. The survivors pressed on, making their way toward a nearby building that seemed to offer some shelter. But as they approached, a haunting realization hit: the world outside the safe zone had been completely transformed. There were no more humans here. The city was abandoned, overrun by the undead, and the remnants of society were little more than a memory. Ethan's thoughts wandered back to the safe zone, to the last moments when everything had crumbled. The moment the barricades had fallen, the gate had breached, and everything they had worked for had been obliterated. He remembered the faces of the civilians who had been trapped inside, the soldiers who had fought to the bitter end. In those final moments, there had been no time for regrets, only survival. "How far are we from the outskirts?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "We're close," Davis replied, his voice tight with fatigue. "But we need to be careful. There's no telling how many zombies are still out here." Ethan nodded, trying to push away the growing sense of dread. They had to make it through. There had to be some way out of this hell. But every step forward felt like it led them deeper into a trap. The safe zone had been their last hope, and now, as they ventured into the unknown, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was nowhere left to run. The group moved through the broken streets, carefully avoiding the open areas where they might be seen. Their footsteps were light, but the occasional screech of a distant door or the moan of an undead creature sent a ripple of fear through the group. It was the silence that unsettled them the most, the eerie stillness of a world that had once been full of life. "Keep moving," Davis urged again, his tone hard. "We've got to get to the safe house in the next block. Once we're there, we'll regroup." The thought of safety, of somewhere to rest, was a fleeting comfort. Ethan knew that the moment they let their guard down, the undead would strike. They couldn't afford to relax, not for a second. As they neared the safe house, something caught Ethan's eye. A flicker of movement. He turned quickly, his weapon raised instinctively, but there was nothing there, just the wind rustling through the abandoned buildings. He frowned, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. The world outside the safe zone was more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. And then, as if to confirm his worst fears, a distant scream shattered the quiet. It wasn't a human scream. It was the unmistakable sound of a creature in pain. But it wasn't alone. The moans of the undead followed shortly after, an echo that seemed to surround them on all sides. "They're close," Davis said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to move now." No time to waste. The group broke into a run, moving toward the shelter of the safe house as quickly as they could. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his every sense on high alert. His mind was a whirl of thoughts. What was that scream? Who was out there? Was it another survivor, or something worse? They reached the building, only to find the door ajar, a trail of blood leading into the dark interior. Ethan motioned for the others to stay back, his weapon at the ready. He cautiously entered first, his breath shallow, listening intently for any signs of life, or death. The interior was eerily quiet. Dust hung in the air, and the faint smell of decay lingered. Ethan's eyes scanned the room, his hand tightening around his weapon. What was waiting for them inside? And how much longer could they survive in a world that seemed to grow more hostile with every passing minute? As he crept further into the building, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A blood-streaked message was scrawled on the wall in what appeared to be human remains. They know. They're coming. The blood-streaked message on the wall sent a chill through Ethan's spine. They know. They're coming. The words seemed to pulse with a dark warning, a sign that whatever lay ahead was not just a threat from the undead. There was something worse, something human, lurking in the shadows. Davis stepped forward, his expression tense. What does it mean? He murmured, barely audible over the sounds of the distant moans and shuffling footsteps of the zombies outside. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. The safe house, which had seemed like a beacon of hope just moments ago, now felt like a trap. The trail of blood on the floor led to a makeshift barricade in the corner, but no bodies. The silence was suffocating, each breath feeling heavier than the last. As he moved closer to the barricade, he motioned for the others to follow, his instincts on high alert. They reached the barricade, and Ethan gingerly pulled aside a piece of wood. The smell of decay was overpowering, but there was something more sinister about it, something that felt like it had been there for longer than they had imagined. His eyes widened when he saw what lay behind it, a small, dark room with shelves of supplies scattered around. But that wasn't what grabbed his attention. It was the bodies. Dozens of them, stacked like firewood. Some were decayed beyond recognition, others still had traces of life in their eyes, frozen in terror. The survivors who had once sought shelter here were now nothing more than twisted remnants, their bodies marred by strange, violent wounds. Ethan's stomach churned, but he pushed the bile back down. They needed answers. Who did this? He whispered, his voice tight with anger. Davis clenched his jaw, his eyes scanning the room. This isn't the work of zombies. Ethan nodded, his thoughts racing. The group had already dealt with countless waves of the undead, but this was different. The sheer brutality of the kills spoke of a mind far more calculating than that of any zombie. We're not alone, Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. There's someone out there, someone human. A sudden noise cut through the tension, a scraping sound coming from deeper within the building. The group froze, weapons raised in an instant. Ethan motioned for them to stay quiet, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It was coming closer. Stay sharp, Davis hissed, signaling for the others to spread out. We don't know what we're dealing with. Ethan's grip tightened around his weapon as he slowly moved toward the source of the noise. Each step felt like an eternity, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up with every creak of the floorboards. They were close, too close. Whatever was out there, it knew they were here. Suddenly, the sound stopped. A tense silence settled over the group as they waited, frozen in place. Ethan's eyes darted from corner to corner, scanning every shadow. Then, without warning, the door at the far end of the room burst open, and a figure lunged toward them. The figure was human, but barely. Its face was pale, gaunt, with dark circles under its eyes. Blood smeared its clothes, and its hands were twitching, as if the body was struggling to contain some terrible force. The person's eyes locked onto Ethan's with a wild, desperate gaze, and for a split second, Ethan could see the fear in them. But that fear quickly turned into something far darker. The figure let out a low growl, its lips pulling back to reveal yellowed, broken teeth. Get down! Davis shouted, pulling Ethan out of the way just as the crazed figure lunged at them. The survivor fell to the ground with a sickening thud, a muffled grunt escaping its throat. Before it could recover, Davis was on top of it, pressing the barrel of his weapon to its forehead. "Who are you?" Davis demanded, his voice harsh. The figure's lips curled into a twisted grin. "You don't know, do you?" it rasped, its voice barely a whisper. "It's not just the undead you have to worry about anymore. They're not the only ones left." The words sent a jolt through Ethan's spine. The safe house had been a shelter for survivors, but something had changed. The message on the wall, the brutal killings, and now this deranged individual, it all pointed to something far more terrifying than just the zombie threat. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking with tension. The figure's grin widened. "The virus, it's evolving. People aren't just turning into zombies anymore. Some of us, we're becoming something worse." The survivor's body twitched violently, as if something inside was fighting to break free. It let out another guttural growl and made a desperate attempt to push Davis away, but the soldier quickly forced the weapon against its skull. "We need answers," Davis said, his voice low but filled with authority. "Who are you working for? What do you know about the virus?" The figure's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and something else, something far more unsettling. "They'll come for you," it whispered. "They've been watching, waiting. You won't be safe anymore." Ethan felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. This wasn't just a fight for survival against the undead, it was a war against something even more dangerous, something hidden within the remnants of humanity itself. With one final, violent convulsion, the figure stopped moving, its body going limp. The silence that followed was deafening. But the fear that had built up in the pit of Ethan's stomach remained, gnawing at him. They had just learned something that could change everything. "Let's move," Davis said, his voice clipped. "We have to get to the next safe house. This place is compromised." But as the group prepared to leave, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. They weren't just running from zombies anymore, they were running from something far more deadly. As the survivors moved through the building, the unsettling encounter with the deranged figure weighed heavily on their minds. The room was now eerily quiet, but the question that had been hanging over them like a dark cloud remained: what was happening to the virus? Was this new form of infection something they could fight, or were they already too far gone? Ethan's thoughts raced, his eyes scanning the surroundings as they made their way to the back exit of the building. He couldn't shake the chilling warning from the deranged survivor. They've been watching, waiting. Who are they? And what exactly was this new virus doing to people? "We need to get to the next safe house," Davis muttered, his tone grim. "This place isn't safe anymore." But even as he spoke, Ethan could feel the weight of the words bearing down on him. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. Something had changed. The zombies were no longer their only threat, and the truth, whatever it was hidden in the very thing they had been running from, the infection. As they exited the building, the city beyond loomed in front of them, a sprawling wasteland of destruction and decay. The once bustling streets were now silent, save for the occasional shuffle of a zombie in the distance. There was no sign of life, no signs of anyone else who might have made it through the chaos of the safe zone's fall. It was as if the world had been swallowed whole by the undead. "We're close," Davis said, his voice tight as he led them down an alleyway. "There's a building up ahead, used to be a medical research facility. If anyone has answers, it's them." The words caught Ethan off guard. A medical research facility? Could it hold the key to what was happening with the virus? He didn't know if he trusted Davis fully yet, but in this new world, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. They had no choice but to follow him. As they neared the building, something felt wrong. Ethan paused, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. The streets were eerily quiet, no sounds of shuffling or moaning. But there was something else, something in the air. A faint scent of something burning reached his nose, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "I don't like this," he muttered, motioning for the group to slow down. Davis shot him a sharp glance. "We don't have time for second-guessing, Ethan. We need answers, and we're not leaving without them. Ethan hesitated but nodded. They continued forward, their movements cautious as they reached the entrance of the building. The door was partially ajar, and the smell of smoke grew stronger. Inside, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The building had been abandoned in a hurry. Shelves of medical supplies were overturned, and papers scattered the floor like forgotten remnants of a lost world. As they moved deeper into the facility, Ethan felt the tension building. The silence was suffocating, and the uncertainty gnawed at his mind. Was this place a safe haven, or was it another trap waiting to be sprung? In the distance, the faint hum of a generator could be heard. Davis gestured for them to follow, and they crept toward the source of the noise. The closer they got, the more palpable the feeling of dread became. They reached a door marked Research Lab, the hum louder now. Davis motioned for them to stop as he carefully opened the door. Inside, the lab was bathed in a dim, sickly light. Rows of computers lined the walls, and the faint glow of screens revealed data, numbers, and images that Ethan couldn't quite make sense of. But what caught his eye was the large tank in the corner of the room, its contents obscured by the haze of smoke and dust. "Is that a tank?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. Davis's face twisted with something between fear and curiosity. "It's a containment tank. But I don't understand. Why is it here?" Ethan's gaze turned to the screen in front of him. There, on the monitor, was a disturbing image, a close-up of a human cell, mutated and pulsating with unnatural growth. The caption below it read, Subject 3 Delta, infection rate, 100%. "What is this?" Ethan whispered, his voice tight with realization. Davis didn't respond immediately. His face was pale as he studied the screen, his eyes wide. This isn't just a virus. This is an experiment. They were trying to make a weapon. A controlled infection. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. A controlled infection? The virus that had ravaged the world wasn't some natural disaster, it was something engineered, something deliberately created. But why? Before Ethan could ask more, a low groan came from behind them. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he spun around. In the doorway stood another figure, another survivor. This one, however, was different. Its eyes glowed a faint, unnatural green, and its skin had taken on an eerie, almost translucent appearance. The person's movements were jerky, uncoordinated, but its presence felt like an immense threat. The figure stepped forward, its mouth opening to reveal teeth too sharp for a human. "Get down!" Davis shouted, pushing Ethan out of the way just as the figure lunged. The room erupted into chaos, with the others trying to restrain the creature. But it was stronger than any human they had encountered. "Is this what they were trying to do?" Ethan shouted over the noise. "Worse," Davis growled, struggling to maintain control. "This is the next stage of the infection. Something worse than zombies." As the battle raged, the truth became horrifyingly clear. Humanity was not just fighting for survival from the undead, they were fighting against something far more dangerous. The line between life and death had been blurred, and they had no idea how deep the corruption ran. In this part, the survivors discover the horrific truth behind the virus, a man-made weapon, and encounter a new, terrifying form of infected human, more dangerous than the zombies. The mounting revelations about the infection's origins and the appearance of a mutated survivor pushed the story into new territory, keeping the suspense high and the stakes rising. Would you like to continue with Part 7? The creature's grotesque screech echoed through the lab, sending a shiver down Ethan's spine. He barely had time to react as the thing lunged at him with unnatural speed. Davis was quicker, tackling it to the ground with a force that sent the mutated survivor sprawling across the floor. But even as it struggled, the creature's eyes glowed with that eerie green light, unnatural, malevolent. It wasn't just infected, it was evolving. "We can't fight this," Ethan shouted, barely dodging a swipe from the creature's claw-like hand. This is what the virus was meant to create." Davis gritted his teeth as he struggled to hold the creature down. "It's the next step in the infection, Ethan. They were experimenting with something more powerful than the undead. The mutated survivor thrashed, its skin seeming to stretch and shift unnaturally as it attempted to break free. Ethan's mind raced, thinking back to the research facility's monitors. They had seen the images of the cells, the mutation, the rapid growth. It wasn't just turning people into zombies, it was turning them into something far worse. "We need to stop it before it gets any worse," Davis panted, his voice strained. Whatever they were doing here, they were playing with fire. And now we're caught in the blaze. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the door. They had to get out of the lab, away from the creature. But more than that, they needed answers. How far had this experiment gone? And how many more of these mutated survivors were out there? The answers were buried somewhere within the lab's wreckage, somewhere in the data that the scientists had left behind. Without warning, the creature broke free from Davis's grip, hurling him backward with a sickening crack. Davis's weapon skittered across the floor, out of reach. For a moment, Ethan thought they were done for. But then Davis, his face bruised and bloodied, pulled himself to his feet, dragging himself toward the creature with an expression of grim determination. "Stay back, Ethan," he shouted. "I'll buy you time." Ethan didn't have to be told twice. He grabbed a nearby pipe, his mind working on instinct as he swung it toward the creature's face. It barely flinched. This thing wasn't like any zombie they had faced before, it was faster, stronger, smarter. "Davis." Ethan called again, his voice desperate. The last thing they needed was to be caught in a fight they couldn't win. Davis was already moving again, slamming into the creature with the force of a freight train. He managed to knock it off balance, but it quickly recovered, its glowing eyes narrowing as it hissed in fury. The creature wasn't just a product of the virus, it was something that had adapted, something that could fight back. Ethan's mind was racing. They couldn't win this fight, not without a plan. And if the creature was the result of the virus evolving, then what else had the virus mutated into? How many more survivors had been turned into these things, and how many of them were hiding, waiting for them to slip up? "We have to get out of here," Ethan shouted, grabbing Davis by the arm and pulling him toward the door. But as they reached the exit, the building seemed to groan, the walls creaking as if something within was shifting. The air felt thick with tension, and Ethan's instincts screamed that something wasn't right. Something far worse than the creature they had just fought was coming. The sound of shuffling feet echoed from deeper within the facility. "They're here," Davis muttered, his voice hoarse. "More of them. And they're getting stronger." Ethan's heart sank. The safe zone had fallen because of an attack from the undead, but now, in this facility, they had uncovered something even more terrifying. The very virus that had plagued the world had evolved into something that could fight back, something that could plan, strategize, and hunt. "Move!" Ethan barked, pulling Davis along as they dashed toward the exit. But it was too late. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, and the building seemed to come alive, the ground trembling beneath their feet. The air grew cold, and a low growl filled the air. Ethan turned to see a new wave of mutated survivors emerging from the shadows, each one more monstrous than the last. Davis cursed under his breath. "We can't outrun them. We need to find somewhere to fight back." Ethan's mind raced. They couldn't face these creatures head-on. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and running out of time. But they had to do something, anything, to stop the spread of this infection before it wiped out what little humanity was left. "Come on," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his chest. "We need to find a way to stop them, before this becomes the new world." With no other options left, they retreated into the darkness, their eyes scanning the area for anything they could use to defend themselves. But in the back of Ethan's mind, one thought burned brightly: the fight for survival was no longer just about zombies, it was about stopping a far more insidious enemy from taking over what was left of the world. The building around them was crumbling, a dilapidated echo of the civilization that once stood. The survivors had fought hard to escape the onslaught of mutated creatures that had overrun the medical research facility. But even as they fled into the night, it was clear that the battle for survival was far from over. What they had uncovered inside that facility wasn't just a glimpse of the past, it was the future of humanity's extinction. The infected had evolved, and in their wake, the world as they knew it was slipping away. Ethan, Davis, and the rest of the survivors had taken refuge in an abandoned underground tunnel system, hoping for some semblance of safety. But deep down, Ethan knew that the real fight wasn't just for food or shelter anymore. It was for answers. For a way to stop the virus before it consumed everything. "We've got to figure out what the next step is," Ethan said, his voice low and full of resolve. "The mutation we saw in that lab, it's just the beginning." Davis nodded, his eyes heavy with the weight of their discovery. He had barely managed to escape with his life after that last confrontation, and now, as they sat in the dim light of their new hiding place, the gravity of their situation was sinking in. "There's no going back," Davis said, running a hand through his hair. "We thought the safe zone was our salvation. We thought we had a chance at surviving. But now we know the truth." Ethan looked out toward the entrance of the tunnel, the distant sound of shuffling feet from above sending a chill down his spine. Zombies, mutated or not, were still out there, lurking in the shadows. But it wasn't just them he had to worry about anymore. The virus itself was their real enemy now. As the night wore on, the group tried to make plans. They shared resources, patched up wounds, and offered quiet reassurances to each other. But the air was thick with uncertainty. What now? Where could they go? Could anyone still be trusted? The research facility had contained some of the answers they sought. The virus wasn't simply turning people into mindless, flesh-hungry monsters anymore. It was adapting. Mutating. Evolving into something much more dangerous, something they couldn't even fully comprehend yet. "We need to get to the source," Ethan said, his voice firm with determination. "We need to find out who was behind this, and what the hell they were trying to do." "But how?" one of the other survivors, Laura, asked, her voice trembling. "We're stuck down here with no way out. We have no weapons, no way to defend ourselves against what's coming. How do we stop this?" Ethan paused, glancing over at Davis, whose eyes were locked on the wall, deep in thought. "The answer lies in the facility," Davis said finally, his tone bitter. It wasn't just about studying the infection. They were creating something new. If we can get to the labs, if we can get to the data, they might have a cure. "A cure?" Laura scoffed, disbelief flashing in her eyes. "There's no cure. This thing has spread too far." "I'm not talking about a cure for everyone," Davis replied sharply. "I'm talking about stopping it before it spreads any further. There has to be something we can use." Ethan felt the weight of Davis's words settle over him. Hope was a fragile thing, easily crushed in a world where everything had fallen apart. But in that moment, it was all they had. They couldn't afford to give up. Not now. The night stretched on, the dark hours filled with the quiet whispers of survival. They rested for what little they could, knowing that dawn would bring new challenges, new horrors. But one thing was clear, the safe zone was gone, the world had changed, and their fight was far from over. As the first light of morning broke through the cracks of the tunnel, the survivors gathered their things. They had no real plan, no clear path forward, but they knew one thing for sure, they were going to fight back. They had to. For themselves. For what was left of humanity. Ethan looked up, his eyes scanning the horizon. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And no matter how many mutated survivors or undead creatures stood in their way, they would keep fighting until the very end. And maybe, just maybe, they could stop the infection from spreading any further. But deep down, Ethan knew one thing for sure, the virus was far more than they had ever expected. And they were not yet ready to face what it had become. They might have escaped the safe zone, but the real nightmare was only just beginning. In the final part, the survivors come to terms with the terrifying new reality of the world. They've discovered that the virus is mutating into something even more dangerous, and now their only hope lies in seeking out the source of the infection, hoping to find a way to stop it. As the sun rises, they make a new commitment to fight for survival, no matter what horrors lie ahead. the fight is far from over, and they are only at the beginning of an even darker journey. This concludes the story. Would you like to work on a new project or need any adjustments to this one?